Miss Marple becomes intrigued when a mysterious lodger checks into a quiet inn without offering a name. By morning, the guest has vanished, leaving behind only a suitcase filled with false clues and unanswered questions. As whispers of espionage and betrayal surface, Miss Marple must uncover the truth before danger spreads beyond the inn's walls. Chapter 1. The Hook. A name missing at breakfast in the quiet village of Lower Becket, where time seemed to trickle rather than pass. Summer had crept in like a polite visitor, unhurried and almost apologetic. Morning dew still clung to the edges of the rose bushes that lined the gravel paths, and swallows stitched loops through the pale blue sky as the town slowly came alive. It was the sort of place where people noticed if you stirred your tea the wrong way, where nothing ever truly happened, and anything that did was remembered for decades. The rose and bramble stood at the edge of the village green, an old stone guest house with ivy climbing its east-facing wall and white lace curtains that framed every window. Owned by Mrs. Claridge, a prim, silver-haired woman with a tight bun and an even tighter sense of routine. The guest house welcomed quiet travelers and elderly vacationers, people looking not for excitement, but for rest, bird songs, and the occasional village fair. That morning, the dining room was as it always was at 8:30. The grandfather clock ticked softly from the corner. The blue porcelain tea set was set neatly on the oak sideboard, toast sets stacked in its silver rack beside tiny jars of rhubarb jam. 3 of the 4 breakfast tables were occupied. Colonel Winthrop, once of the Royal Engineers, sat near the fireplace with the folded Times he hadn't truly read in years. Across from him, Miss Lillian Hartley, still draped in black 3 years after her husband's passing, prattled about a cousin's arthritis and the cost of train fares. The 3rd table was occupied by Mr. Pomeroy, the visiting clergyman from St. Anne's in Crestwood, who had just returned from his morning constitutional, his shoes still damp from the grass. Miss Marple, dressed in soft lavender and seated at a table by the window, sipped her tea quietly while finishing a row of intricate stitches on her pale pink wool. She was not entirely unnoticed, though most guests mistook her for a gentle spinster from the next county over. Only those who knew her well, which was few indeed, understood how little escaped her eyes behind those half-moon spectacles. Mrs. Claridge entered from the kitchen with a tray of boiled eggs and a slight furrow to her brow. She moved mechanically between tables, placing dishes with practiced grace, but her movements were stiffer than usual. "Excuse me," said Colonel Winthrop, without looking up. "Where's the fellow who came in late last night? Room 6, was it?" Mrs. Claridge gave a polite, almost hesitant nod. "He hasn't come down yet." Miss Hartley, who was always alert to hints of drama, immediately turned toward the landlady. "Oh, but he was a mystery, wasn't he? Arrived after 11. I saw the lights from my room. Yes, very tired looking." Mrs. Claridge murmured, more to herself. "Didn't even leave his name in the register. Said he'd sign in the morning." That, more than anything else, caught Miss Marple's attention. Her needle paused mid-air. "No name?" she repeated gently. Mrs. Claridge nodded. "I thought it strange, but it was late, and he looked like he'd been traveling for hours. Came from Dover, he said. Foreign, wasn't he?" Miss Hartley offered, eyes gleaming. "Tall, olive skin, and a limp. He definitely limped when he came up the steps." Colonel Winthrop made a dismissive sound. "Probably just some journalist or a customs man, always skulking about ports and borders." At that moment, the front staircase creaked loudly, not the usual groan of old wood under careful feet, but a sudden, sharp sound like someone rushing. Then came a cry. Alice, the young maid barely out of school, appeared in the doorway a second later, her face pale, her apron askew. Breath caught in her throat. "Mrs. Claridge, he's not moving," she stammered. "Room 6, the man. He's just lying there, All motion in the room ceased. Mrs. Claridge turned white. "Did you shake him?" "Alice," she whispered. Alice nodded, trembling. "He's cold. His eyes are open." Colonel Winthrop stood like a man summoned to battle, brushing crumbs from his lapel. "I'll fetch Dr. Reeves at once," Miss Hartley gasped and clutched her chest theatrically. Mr. Pomeroy mumbled a prayer, but Miss Marple stood slowly, carefully folding her knitting and placing it into her handbag. She said nothing, not yet, but her eyes were calm and calculating. She turned to Mrs. Claridge. "Perhaps it would be wise," she said softly, "to ensure no one goes up there until the doctor arrives." Mrs. Claridge nodded stiffly, then looked to Alice, who still trembled in the doorway. "Did you notice anything else, dear?" Alice swallowed. The window was open. The sheets were, strange, wrinkled like he'd been tossing about, but he was just. Still, Miss Marple walked to the foot of the stairs, but did not climb. She looked upward, past the worn banister, toward the silent hall above. No name, no luggage, no one who saw him arrive properly, and now no pulse. It would take days for the police to determine cause of death, weeks for the villagers to cease whispering. But even now, before any facts were laid bare, Miss Marple felt that subtle itch of the mind, that quiet sense that something had not happened by chance. Death had arrived in Lower Becket, and as always, it had come dressed as a guest. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. Whispers in Lower Becket news spread faster than the morning sun could warm the hedgerows. By midday, every cobbled lane, garden gate, and church pew in Lower Becket buzzed with speculation. No matter how charming or slow-moving a village might appear, nothing stirred its blood like the scent of mystery, and nothing caused its heart to race like death in a locked room. At the Rose and Bramble, Constable Giles from the local station stood awkwardly at the threshold of room 6, notebook trembling slightly in his ink-stained fingers. The body had been left untouched, per the instructions of Dr. Reeves, who was expected any moment from neighboring Wickley. In the dim room, the unknown man lay sprawled in the bed, eyes still open, though now mercifully covered by a white cloth. His features were not entirely English, perhaps Southern European, perhaps something else altogether. His coat was hung neatly on the peg, but the pockets were empty. No wallet, no passport, no letter, not even a matchbox or coin. Miss Marple, standing just inside the door with Mrs. Claridge, took in the surroundings with practiced subtlety. Others saw disorder. She noticed the order beneath the chaos, the candle stub on the sill. She murmured quietly, almost to herself, "Quite used, though the electricity is working." Mrs. Claridge, too shaken to respond properly, only nodded. "I didn't hear him moving about. He didn't even come down for water." Back in the lounge, the remaining guests gathered in a loose cluster, gossip blooming like an untrimmed vine. "He must have poisoned himself," declared Miss Hartley, her voice hushed but urgent. "That or a heart attack. Perhaps heartbreak. Foreigners are often dramatic." Mr. Pomeroy looked scandalized. "Lillian, really?" Colonel Winthrop snorted. "Nothing dramatic about death. It's usually simple, fast or slow, accidental or deliberate." "Oh, how comforting," said Miss Hartley with a dry twist of her lips. By the time Reverend Dobbs stopped by to check on everyone's spirits and subtly ask what had happened, half the town had already decided the guest was a spy, a fugitive, or both. "It's this modern world," murmured Mrs. Penholigan from the village bakery later that afternoon. "Strangers coming in on late trains, no sense of belonging, no roots." Even the vicar's wife, a woman who rarely spoke unless regarding jam making, offered her theory at the grocer's. "A lover's quarrel, I think. He came to escape something, or someone." But Miss Marple, ever the listener, did not contribute to the flurry of talk. She merely returned to her knitting, which had grown slightly uneven in its last few rows. something that hadn't happened in years. Later that evening, Inspector Mallory arrived from the county. He was a stout man with dark eyes and a permanent air of mild annoyance, especially toward village speculations. He conducted his preliminary inquiries with professional detachment, questioning Mrs. Claridge, the maid Alice, and each of the guests in turn. What time did the man arrive? He asked Mrs. Claridge. Just before 11, she said. He walked from the station. No luggage, just a rolled-up coat over his arm. He gave no name? No, sir. Did he say why he'd come to Lower Becket? She hesitated. Said he was just passing through. Needed rest. Looked very tired. Foreign, I thought. Had an accent, but faint. And the others saw him? Alice nodded quickly. I took him to his room, sir. He didn't want anything but sleep, Colonel Winthrop added. I heard him walk up the stairs, limping. Miss Marple, when questioned, simply said he was polite, reserved, quiet. I noticed he favored his left side when he moved. And what do you make of it, Miss Marple? The inspector asked, perhaps with the faintest note of condescension. Oh, I shouldn't presume. She replied with a smile. But it is strange that a man so meticulous with his clothes and manners would forget to sign his name. Or perhaps he didn't forget. Perhaps he didn't want to be remembered. The inspector paused at that, then scribbled something down. By nightfall, the village seemed to hold its breath. Shutters were drawn early, lamps burned longer, and every gathering, from the knitting circle at the chapel to the elderly men near the pub fire, was filled with questions. No one could recall a murder in Lower Becket in over 30 years, and now they weren't even sure it was a murder. Miss Marple, who had taken an evening walk past the church and the overgrown graveyard, paused by the edge of the green. The moon hung pale over the rooftops, and crickets chirped between stone walls. She stood still, watching the darkness for a long while. It's not the silence that tells you, she said softly to herself, but what's missing inside it? The next morning, another odd detail emerged. Alice, while turning down the guest's room for the coroner's examination, found a scrap of paper folded tightly into the lining of the man's coat. It was damp, blurred, but one word was still legible. Heatherdown. What's Heatherdown? The inspector asked sharply. No one knew. Miss Marple did not react, but her eyes narrowed slightly behind her glasses. She had heard that word before, once, long ago, though not in relation to a place. No one had seen the man arrive. No one knew his name. And now a single word would have to pull the thread of truth. Chapter 3, Early Investigation. Beneath the chatter. The patterned morning after the incident, Lower Becket woke under a hazy sky, where the sun fought thin clouds that refused to break. Birds sang, yes, but the tune had shifted. Something in the air felt brittle. At the Rose and Bramble, breakfast was served more quietly than usual, the clinking of cutlery sounding louder in the heavy hush. Alice moved slowly between tables, placing tea and toast with a timid hand. Her usual chatter had vanished, her eyes lingering on the empty chair where the unnamed guest should have sat. Room 6 was locked now, sealed until the coroner completed his report, and the weight of it seemed to press down on the entire house. Miss Marple sat near the window, her knitting untouched. The basket remained by her side, but her hands were still, resting on the fabric of her lavender blouse. Her gaze, soft and unthreatening, passed over each guest in turn. Miss Hartley was speaking, as she always did. You know what I think, she said, slicing her toast with military precision. I think he was a courier, a spy, maybe Russian, or French, something foreign. Miss Hartley, Mr. Pomeroy sighed gently. Not every stranger is a villain, she sniffed. Well, they do say trouble comes by train more often than by foot. Colonel Winthrop grunted into his eggs. Could be a robbery gone wrong. Smugglers these days use all sorts of places. Villages are ideal. Quiet, Unguarded, gullible, Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Smugglers? In Lower Becket? Winthrop shrugged. There's the coast not far off, and plenty of disused paths in the woods. A good drop point for contraband, I'd wager. Then he wouldn't have come to the Rose and Bramble. Miss Marple replied softly. He'd have stayed in the woods. Smugglers aren't fond of guest books. Winthrop raised an eyebrow. Unless they want to be seen, or pretend to be seen, Miss Marple added gently. Then sipped her tea. This subtle comment did not draw much reaction. Miss Hartley blinked and resumed buttering her scone. Mr. Pomeroy simply looked at his plate, but Miss Marple noticed the flicker behind Winthrop's eyes, a tightening, perhaps, or a calculation delayed by thought. She filed it away quietly after breakfast, while the others went about their day with forced normalcy. Miss Marple took a stroll through the village, not aimlessly. She never did anything quite aimlessly, but with the gentle rhythm of someone who had seen many things and preferred to notice rather than seek. She walked past the greengrocer, the churchyard, the post office. She paused by the war memorial and then, after a moment's thought, stepped inside the village library. It was nearly empty, save for a young man behind the desk, adjusting a crooked stack of gardening books. "Good morning," she said. "Miss Marple." "Morning. Still with us in Lower Becket?" "For another few days, yes," she smiled. "I thought I might check something in the directory." He nodded, gesturing to the far shelf. "Still alphabetical. No one's tampered with the order." She chuckled lightly. It was charming how people often underestimated her, how they assumed her interest in directories or registers was merely old-fashioned curiosity. She found what she was looking for quickly. The name Heather Down. There was no mention of it as a street, business, or address in Lower Becket or the surrounding villages. Yet the word rang familiar. She walked back through the green, eyes scanning the church notice board, the chalk sign outside the bakery, and the flapping banners for the upcoming village fete. No clues, nothing with that strange, almost fabricated name. It wasn't until she returned to the Rose and Bramble, entering quietly through the side garden path, that her eyes caught something new. The flower beds, neat, clean rows of petunias and marigolds. Yet one patch near the back window had been recently disturbed, the soil darker, fresher. A spade leaned against the fence. Miss Marple crouched gently beside the bed and ran her gloved fingers along the soil's edge. Not just fresh, turned, lightly, as if something had been hidden or removed. Alice stepped outside then, carrying a basket of folded linen. "Lovely morning," Miss Marple called casually. Alice jumped. "Oh, I didn't see you, ma'am." "No harm done," Miss Marple smiled. "Are these flower beds all your work?" Alice blushed. "Mostly Mrs. Claridge's, but I help, especially near the windows. This one looks very fresh. Were you planting something yesterday?" Alice shook her head. "No, ma'am, not that one. I watered the others, but I didn't touch that bed." Miss Marple stood slowly. "Interesting." She said nothing more. She didn't need to by mid-afternoon. Inspector Mallory returned. He looked tired, his shoes muddy, and his temper thinner than usual. No identification on the body, he reported in the lounge, but the coroner says the death wasn't natural. Some kind of paralysis agent, quick, quiet, almost invisible. Whoever gave it to him knew exactly what they were doing. The guests murmured. Miss Hartley gasped. "Poison?" Mallory nodded. "Yes, most likely administered during the night. No sign of entry." Asked Winthrop. "None. Door was locked. Window open, yes, but no footprints outside." "Strange that." Miss Marple spoke then, softly. "Not strange if something was passed before the window was opened." Mallory blinked. "You think the killer was already inside?" "I think the man was not alone in that room at some point," she said. "Whether for conversation or confrontation, I don't know. But it is unusual, isn't it, that a man would die without struggle and without anyone hearing a thing, yet leave no trace of companionship? Mallory crossed his arms. You mean to say someone sat beside him while he died? Or perhaps, she said calmly, just after, outside. A breeze rustled the ivy along the eastern wall. Inside, the silence grew thick again. Miss Marple excused herself shortly after and returned to her room. As she passed the corridor, she paused just beside the linen closet. From inside, she could hear someone breathing, shallow, nervous. She made no comment, no accusation. She simply walked on, her footsteps silent on the carpet. But her eyes were sharper than ever. Chapter 4. First Suspects. The faces they chose to blame be. The time the village clock struck 4, Lower Becket had already found its villain, or to be precise, several. Whispers circulated like bees in clover, each one more certain than the last, though none built on more than coincidence, and suspicion dotted the rose and bramble. Inspector Mallory gathered the household in the sitting room, not as a formal interrogation, but as a measure of containment. The death was officially ruled suspicious, and everyone under the roof was now, technically, a person of interest. The term unsettled them, though Miss Marple could see clearly that some were more disturbed by the social implication than the threat of arrest. The room smelled faintly of polish and rosewater. The summer breeze rustled the curtains, and outside, birds chirped with no regard for the dead man upstairs. Inspector Mallory stood in front of the hearth, hands behind his back. Let's begin with the obvious. The deceased arrived late, spoke to only a few of you, and was found dead by morning. He signed no name. He had no papers, and he left behind only a cryptic word on a folded scrap of paper. Heatherdown, murmured Mr. Pomeroy. Mallory nodded. Quite. It means nothing to our local registry or council records. Not a street, not a town, possibly a code name or a personal reference. Miss Hartley gave a dramatic sigh. He was probably running from someone or something. Miss Marple, who had settled herself into a delicate floral armchair, said nothing, but quietly observed the face of Colonel Winthrop. He was still, his expression unreadable, but too unreadable. Inspector Mallory tapped the notebook in his hand. Let's discuss motive. Alice the maid saw him last. Mrs. Claridge interacted with him. But what of the guests? Colonel Winthrop cleared his throat. I never spoke to the man. I merely observed him. A soldier learns to notice the way others carry themselves. And what did you notice, Colonel? Asked Miss Marple gently. He looked at her for a beat too long. That he walked like someone used to being chased. A curious thing to say. And you, Miss Hartley? Asked the inspector. She fluttered her hand. Well, he barely looked at me, which is strange enough in itself. But I dare say he looked tired. Poor thing. Haunted, even, Mr. Pomeroy added. He kept his head down. Polite, but distant. Almost as if he didn't want to be seen. Mallory stepped closer. And yet he chose a guest house in the very center of a village, surrounded by chatter and routine. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Sometimes hiding in plain sight is the cleverest hiding of all. Mallory turned to Alice, who sat near the doorway, hands clutched in her lap. You brought him his key. Did you notice anything unusual? Alice swallowed. He was kind, sir. Tired, yes, but calm. He didn't seem afraid, just done, like he had finished something. There was a pause. Mallory glanced down at his notes. Then let's move to the next question. Who could have entered room 6 during the night? A hush fell. The locks on each guest room were old but functional. Room 6 had been found locked from the inside, the key still on the nightstand. If the window was used, Mallory continued, there are no signs of a forced climb. No scuffed mud, no handprints, no bent ivy. It's as though no one came in at all. Unless, said Miss Marple quietly, the person was already in the building. Mallory turned. "You believe it was someone here?" "I believe," she replied, "that there is such a thing as accidental proximity, and then there is purposeful positioning." The inspector frowned, but it was the colonel who finally shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You seem very ready to suggest this was murder, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "What if it was suicide? Perhaps he took something, felt guilt, wanted to disappear." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, that is certainly possible, but men who wish to disappear do not usually leave behind half a name." And a window opened to invite curiosity. Mallory returned to the front of the room. "I won't detain any of you further today," he said, "but until we have clearer answers, I must ask you not to leave the village. We'll be collecting handwriting samples later. The paper the word Heatherdown was written on may yet yield something." He left shortly after, but not before taking a long glance at the coat hooks and the locked drawer behind the reception desk. Once the inspector was gone, tension loosened just enough for conversation to resume. Quietly at first, "I think it's the colonel," whispered Miss Hartley to Alice the moment they were alone near the stairwell. "Warm men always carry something with them. Ghosts, rage. He's to calm." Alice looked unsure. "But the colonel has been coming here for years. He even sends Mrs. Claridge postcards from Spain." "Exactly," Miss Hartley said. "He knows us. That's the perfect cover." Elsewhere, Mr. Pomeroy was speaking softly to Miss Marple. "I never like to suggest things, but, well, Miss Hartley loves drama. She reads crime novels like scripture. She's not as delicate as she seems, and yet," Miss Marple said kindly, "neither is she someone who would risk prison over a stranger in the night." Pomeroy nodded. "You think the killer knew the victim, don't you?" "I think the killer knew something about him," she replied, "and I think someone here is pretending not to know a thing." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and cast long shadows across the fields, Miss Marple sat once more in the garden, her knitting in her lap. She wasn't working the needles, just staring down at the threads, the knots, the loops, watching how small imperfections made the whole pattern shift. People were much the same. One misplaced stitch, one offbeat comment, and suddenly the whole story unraveled. She whispered something to herself then. Just one word, Heatherdown. The name was not just a place. It was a person, and someone in that house had spoken it before, long before the paper was ever folded into that. Chapter 5, A Hidden Clue. The fold nobody checked. Following day began with gentle rain, tapping the windows of the rose and bramble, turning the garden paths into glistening ribbons of earth. Most of the guests remained indoors, their plans to stroll about the village or visit the antique market quietly abandoned. But the atmosphere inside the guest house remained heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the unease. The body of the unnamed man had been taken in the early morning, carefully wrapped and removed by two men from the coroner's office. They were polite but brisk, their voices low, their steps heavy. The door to room 6 had been reopened only briefly, just long enough for Alice to strip the bed and remove the linens. It was then, among the folds of the sheet, that something curious had fallen to the floor. It was Miss Marple, passing by on her way to fetch her post from the front desk, who saw Alice bent low, frozen, a small rectangle of paper in her hand. "What have you found, dear?" she asked gently. Alice jumped. "It's nothing, ma'am. Just a bit of well." Miss Marple stepped closer. The maid's fingers trembled as she handed her the paper. It was a postage label, torn at the edge, slightly water-damaged, but still legible. The return address had been smudged beyond recognition, but the destination read, H.D. C.O. The Stag's Lantern, Northshire. Miss Marple tilted her head. The Stag's Lantern. Curious, Alice furrowed her brow. "Isn't that a pub?" "It was, many years ago. In Northshire, quite far from here, but not unwalkable for a man seeking quiet." "You think he stayed there?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps he was meant to. She took the paper carefully and folded it into her handbag without another word. Later that morning, she asked Mrs. Claridge a seemingly innocent question over tea. Did the gentleman in room 6 use any of the stationery? I recall there's a small stack in each drawer. Mrs. Claridge blinked. Oh yes, of course. Every room has writing paper, though hardly anyone uses it these days. He didn't leave a note, if that's what you mean. Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. Still, I wonder, would you terribly mind if I looked? It's been known to help, you see. People often leave traces without realizing. She expected some hesitation, but Mrs. Claridge simply nodded. Of course, Miss Marple. If anyone can make sense of this. Room 6 still held the faintest scent of lavender and damp linen. The curtains were drawn back now, letting in the gray light, which softened the room's edges. The bed was bare, the mattress already turned over, and the furniture reset. But the small writing desk near the window was untouched. Miss Marple opened the drawer slowly. Inside was the typical offering: 2 sheets of cream paper, a cheap blue pen, and a cracked leather blotter. But it was the blotter that drew her attention. She removed it gently, running her fingers along the surface, and there, faint but unmistakable, was the ghost of a message. A few words had bled into the leather. Not complete sentences, not quite readable, but fragments, enough to suggest someone had written a letter and taken it with them. She closed the drawer and returned to the hall, her steps light, her eyes thoughtful. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the local postmistress, Mrs. Trench, a talkative woman with a sharp nose and an unquenchable thirst for detail. Ah, Miss Marple, strange days indeed, aren't they? She chirped as the bell above the shop door jingled. Quite so, Miss Marple said with a polite smile. I was hoping you might help me with something trivial, of course. Have you sent any parcels recently to a place called the Stag's Lantern in Northshire? Mrs. Trench's eyes lit up. Oh yes. Twice this month, as a matter of fact. Small ones. Same name on both. Initials only, HD something, wrapped in brown paper, very light. And the stamps were foreign. I remember because I had to explain how to convert them. Foreign. French, I think. No. Wait, Swiss. Yes, the Red Cross emblem was faint on the corner. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. And the sender? Didn't sign anything. Paid cash. Youngish man, foreign accent, olive skin, limped slightly. Miss Marple's heart ticked in rhythm. And when was the last parcel? 3 days before the guest arrived. I don't believe Colonel Winthrop murdered him, she said, calmly, as if speaking of the weather. Though he may have feared him. He may have wished him gone. But fear alone does not explain the method. Inspector Mallory, summoned quietly by Mrs. Claridge moments after Miss Marple's confrontation, entered the room then. He'd been listening just outside. I must say, Miss Marple, he muttered, you have a way of laying out a net before I've even found the thread. She gave him a polite nod, only observing, Inspector. You see, the man in room 6 died with no sign of struggle, but we now know he was frightened, unwell, carrying secrets, and he had tried to write a letter. He wrote it, then took it, but the note was never sent, Mallory said. No, she replied, because he was interrupted. Mallory frowned. By Winthrop, perhaps, or perhaps by someone else entirely. Silence. Miss Marple turned to the group. May I ask a question? They nodded. Who touched the man's coat? They looked at one another. I did, said Alice, when I folded it. I brushed against it, said Winthrop. Hung it when I saw it on the floor. Miss Hartley began, then stopped. No, I didn't. Miss Marple's eyes landed on Mr. Pomeroy, who had remained unnaturally still. You didn't mention it, Mr. Pomeroy, but I remember seeing you near the stairs the morning after, carrying a handkerchief. He blinked. I helped Mrs. Claridge with the mail. She had already finished the post, Miss Marple said softly. But someone had to retrieve something, didn't they? Mallory narrowed his eyes. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple turned to Pomeroy. Reverend. You knew him, didn't you? He said nothing. I believe you met during the war. In Geneva, or just after. Not as friends. As enemies once, but eventually allies. You were both part of an underground mission, were you not? Mr. Pomeroy's face lost all color. I never wanted any of this, he whispered. He said he would expose everyone involved. He was mad, Miss Marple. Not dangerous, just mad. And what did you do? I only meant to talk to him, Pomeroy said. I went up after midnight. We argued. I tried to calm him. He was sweating, trembling. Said someone else was going to silence him. He gave me the paper with Heatherdown written on it. Said I should take it if anything happened. And then? He collapsed, Pomeroy said hoarsely. I thought it was a fainting spell. I left him. I didn't even check. I didn't know he was gone. Mallory stared at him. You didn't call for help. I was scared, he whispered. If anyone knew we'd spoken. If anyone knew I was there. Miss Marple folded her hands. So he did not die of murder, nor suicide. He died of illness, perhaps accelerated by years of stress. But the mystery, the true crime, was in how everyone scattered like birds once the silence set in. Colonel Winthrop sank into his chair. Miss Hartley quietly wept, and Pomeroy buried his face in his hands. After a long pause, Miss Marple rose. Truth is not always punishment, she said gently, but hiding it always is. Chapter 8, Miss Marple's Final Test. A reaction cannot be the following morning. The village had fallen into that peculiar rhythm only the English countryside seems to master. After a scandal, quiet judgment dressed in civility. Curtains were drawn with extra care. Shopkeepers offered their greetings with tight-lipped smiles. And at the Rose and Bramble, the teapot was refilled more often than anyone drank it. Colonel Winthrop had secluded himself in his room. Miss Hartley avoided eye contact, though her lips seemed desperate to confess something else entirely. Mr. Pomeroy, having spoken briefly with Inspector Mallory, was no longer under suspicion of direct wrongdoing, but he wore the look of a man who had glimpsed the shame of his own cowardice and could not quite look away. Miss Marple, however, was humming as she walked the garden path. It was here she spotted Alice, kneeling at the flower beds again, not tending them, but simply staring at the damp soil. Thinking, dear? Miss Marple asked kindly. Alice looked up, startled. Just wondering how people can look so normal when everything feels broken. Sometimes people look normal because they've learned how to hide cracks, Miss Marple replied. And sometimes they look normal because they're finally free of the burden of hiding. Alice said nothing. Her hands pressed into the soft earth, and her mouth moved, almost to speak. But the words never arrived. Miss Marple didn't push her. She simply offered a soft nod and continued her walk. That afternoon, the old lady asked for a gathering, not formal this time, not an interrogation, but just a tea, as she put it, to make peace. Mrs. Claridge arranged the table with her finest china. The lounge was bright with natural light, the storm having passed, and the villagers' fear ebbing slowly with the clouds. The table was set for 5, Miss Marple, Colonel Winthrop, Miss Hartley, Mr. Pomeroy, and Alice. When they were seated, Miss Marple began, her voice gentle. I've often found, she said, that people rarely show their truth when you ask them. But when you watch them, when you let them sit long enough with silence, the truth shows itself. Like steam from a kettle. It's inevitable. Colonel Winthrop crossed his arms. We've already told our truths, Miss Marple. Some of you have, she said with a polite smile. Some truths were simply delayed. Some were withheld. But one truth, I fear, has been buried under too much politeness. She poured the tea with practiced grace, then placed a small object in the center of the table, a ring, a simple, thin silver band with a tiny emerald at its center. "I found this in the flower bed yesterday," she said calmly, "just beneath the loose soil, near the back window of room 6. They stared at it. Miss Hartley gasped softly. That's not mine." "No," said Miss Marple. "It belonged to the man in room 6. "How do you know?" asked Alice, her voice thinner than usual. "Because he wore it when he checked in. A small detail. I noticed it on his left hand when he signed nothing in the ledger. Most people wouldn't notice something so plain. But I did." Pomeroy shifted in his chair. "So what does it mean?" "It means someone removed it," said Miss Marple. "Someone who was afraid it would reveal something. Perhaps an engraving, or fingerprints, or perhaps they simply wanted to ensure no one connected him to what came before." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I didn't tell anyone about the ring until now. I wanted to see who would react." They all remained still, except for Alice. Her breath hitched, barely, but enough. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft. "You see, the garden was only tended by 2 people, Mrs. Claridge, and you, Alice." Alice shook her head. "No, I didn't." Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "You knew him, didn't you?" Alice's face crumpled. "Yes," she whispered. "But not how you think." The room fell silent. Even the tick of the wall clock seemed to hush itself. "He was my father," she said. Miss Hartley gasped. Pomeroy closed his eyes. Winthrop stiffened. "I never knew him," Alice continued. "Only stories. My mother. She never spoke his name, only said he left us before I was born. But 2 months ago, I received a letter. From him, from Switzerland. Said he had watched me from a distance. Knew I worked here. Said he was sick. Said he wanted to meet. Quietly, without pressure. Just to see me." Miss Marple nodded, not surprised. Alice's voice cracked. "He came here for me. Not to expose anyone. Not to threaten. He came to say goodbye. And the ring? He gave it to me. That night, when I went up to see him after everyone had gone to bed. He said it was my mother's once. Said it was all he had left to give. I didn't want anyone to ask questions, so I buried it outside the window." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "He died while I was there," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do. I sat with him for hours. Then I locked the door and ran back to my room." Miss Marple leaned forward, took her hand gently. "You should have said something. I was afraid," she said. "Afraid no one would believe me. That I'd be blamed. That I'd lose everything. But instead," Miss Marple said, "you were left with guilt that wasn't yours to carry." Alice sobbed softly, and no one spoke. At last, Colonel Winthrop stood. "I believe we owe you an apology, Miss Marple," he said. Miss Marple shook her head. "Not to me, to the truth." And with that, the house, for the first time in days, finally exhaled. Chapter 9. The Reveal. Truth in the gentle voice. By the time the sun began its descent, stretching long golden shadows across the hedgerows and ivy-wrapped stone walls, a deceptive calm blanketed Lower Becket. Birds chirped from the rooftops. A light breeze whispered across the village green, and inside the rose and bramble, the guests sat with their teacups, trying to convince themselves that the worst had passed. But Miss Marple knew better. She had not rested since the evening before. She did not pace, nor fret, nor visibly worry, but her thoughts had been working through the night like a slow-turning wheel. She replayed every expression, every choice of words, every tremble of the hand that accompanied a lie. And it wasn't just who had lied. It was why. Because the man had not simply died. He had been erased. And someone had tried to do it kindly. That morning, Miss Marple asked Inspector Mallory to return to the Rose and Bramble, but not as a uniformed enforcer. She requested a quiet gathering in the lounge, just for clarity, she'd said, before the village buries something deeper than a body. He arrived, curious but cautious, and followed her into the lounge where Colonel Winthrop, Miss Hartley, Mr. Pomeroy, Alice, and Mrs. Claridge were already seated. The atmosphere was more tense than respectful. The air had that sharp weight, like the final act of a stage play no one wanted to perform, but couldn't stop watching. Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, backlit by the gray light seeping through the tall windows. Her tone was, as always, impossibly gentle. "I've come to understand something," she began, "that has troubled me since the beginning." They leaned in, quietly, carefully. "The method of death," she said, "was too perfect." Colonel Winthrop shifted. Pomeroy swallowed. Miss Hartley's brow creased. He had no wound, no sign of struggle, no note, no known enemies. And yet he died in the most final way possible, by something nearly untraceable. Mallory nodded. "The coroner believes it was cyanide, perhaps taken by the victim himself." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Not taken, given." Gasps fluttered around the room. "I've looked at the facts again and again," she continued, "and something never sat right." The man checked in quietly. He avoided names, yet told people just enough to stir memory. Then he died with no resistance, as though he expected it. She paused. "And yet," she said, "he wasn't alone that night." Mallory looked up. "We've been through this." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Yes, and we assumed the person who entered room 6 left no trace. But someone did leave a trace. Just not in the room." From her pocket, she pulled a folded paper, stained and wrinkled. This was in the flower bed beneath the guest house window. A postage label from a parcel meant for the man in room 6. It had been torn, buried. "And you think someone was trying to hide it?" asked Mallory. "I know they were," she said, "because they also buried this." She held up the small silver ring, delicate, unadorned except for a green gem and a faint engraving inside. "I recognized this on the man's hand when he arrived. It was gone when he was found. And now we know it was removed, not stolen." Miss Marple turned to Alice. "You told us the man was your father, that he gave you the ring, and I believe you. But you didn't remove it after his death. Someone else did. Someone who went into that room thinking to protect you." All eyes turned to Mrs. Claridge. She did not speak. "You didn't mean to harm him," Miss Marple said gently. "You wanted to frighten him, to make him leave. You saw the way Alice looked at him. Something passed between them, and you recognized it instantly. You feared he was a danger to her, not a murderer, not a criminal, but a threat to her peace, to her reputation, to her heart." Still, Mrs. Claridge did not answer. "You brought him tea, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked. "Your own hands. The same ritual you've used for every new guest. But that time, you added something. Just a little. Something old. Something bitter." Mallory's voice broke the silence. "Bitter almonds. Cyanide. I found your apothecary drawer," Miss Marple said, turning to Mrs. Claridge. "Half a bottle of crushed seeds. Very old, probably from before rationing ended. It was dusty, but the top had been opened recently." Mrs. Claridge closed her eyes. "I only wanted to scare him," she whispered. "I didn't think it would. I didn't know he was ill." Miss Marple's expression softened. "He told you, didn't he? Before he drank it?" Mrs. Claridge nodded. "Yes," she said. "He said he was dying, that he only wanted to see Alice once. He promised to leave the next morning, but by then I had already given it, just 2 drops in his tea. I thought it would make him sick, send him away." Alice let out a quiet sob. "He died in his sleep," Mrs. Claridge said. "I didn't know until morning. I went up to check. I saw the ring. I panicked, took it, buried the label, hid the truth." Miss Marple stepped forward and took her hand. "You were trying to protect someone you love," she said. "But the truth never stays buried, no matter how deep the soil." Mallory stood slowly. "I'll have to take this forward," he said. "But given the circumstances, his condition, your intent, the Crown may show leniency." Mrs. Claridge looked up. "I'm ready." Alice placed a hand on her shoulder. "I forgive you," she said. "But I'll never forget." The room remained silent for several long seconds. Not tense, not angry, just quiet. Miss Marple turned away. Her work done, she stepped into the hall, her feet light, her breath calm. The man had no name when he arrived, but in death, he had finally become visible. Chapter 10, Aftermath. When the village sleeps again, rain had long stopped, but the ground was still wet beneath the rose beds at the Rose and Bramble. The scent of damp earth clung to the hedges, and the last petals of the season trembled slightly in the wind, as if the garden too remembered what had passed within its walls. Henrik Darnier had been laid to rest 5 days earlier in Lower Beckett's churchyard, in the far corner near the yew tree that twisted like an old man's back. His grave was modest, unmarked except for a wooden cross Alice carved herself. The initials H.D. scorched into the wood with a candle flame, and the tip of a rusted nail. No bells rang, no hymn was sung, and yet something sacred had happened there. Not because of ceremony, but because the village had, in its quietest way, looked at itself and chosen not to turn away. At the guest house, things had not returned to normal, not quite. There were still long silences at breakfast. The windows still stayed open a little longer, as if they needed air, and guests, even the new ones, noticed the hush in the hallway by room 6, but healing had begun, and no one watched over it more quietly, more precisely, than Miss Marple. She hadn't planned to stay so long. Her luggage had sat packed at the foot of her bed for 2 days now, but she hadn't left. Not yet. Not until she was sure the wound had not only closed, but that the scar left behind would carry meaning. Each morning, she sipped her tea in the garden or by the front window, her knitting always nearby but rarely touched. She watched not the road, but the people. Alice moving more firmly through the house. Miss Hartley, pausing before she spoke now. Mr. Pomeroy, walking a little slower, head lower, his sermons heavier with self-examination. And Colonel Winthrop, gone, yes, but not forgotten. A single postcard had arrived from Dover, addressed to no one, but left on the front desk. It read, "Some debts cannot be paid, but I will carry the weight." Mrs. Claridge, of course, was no longer there. After her quiet confession, she had left willingly with Inspector Mallory. There had been no trial, not yet. The authorities had deemed her action unintended in result, though reckless in method. She had acted in fear, they said, not malice. The case would pass through inquiry, but it was likely that time, remorse, and her age would write a gentler ending than prison bars. In the meantime, Alice had stepped forward. At first, she did so cautiously, unsure whether the world would let her. But Miss Marple noticed the small changes, the way she corrected a supplier over the phone, or the way she redirected Miss Hartley when she overstepped with gossip. The girl who had once stood like a shadow now stood like a tree, still growing, but rooted. On the 6th day, Miss Marple found her in the garden after breakfast, tending the flower bed beneath room 6's window. "You're planting new ones," Miss Marple observed, watching as Alice pressed marigold bulbs into the soil. "They bloom in autumn." Alice replied softly, "I thought it might be good. Something to grow after everything." Miss Marple gave a warm nod. Growth often follows endings. Alice dusted her hands on her apron. "I've been thinking about him, Henrik." Miss Marple waited, her silence always an invitation. "I don't think I loved him," Alice said finally. "I didn't know him, but I think I could have, and I think he came here hoping I would." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And that would have been enough for him." Alice looked up. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," she said. "People who've made peace with their past don't demand love. They offer it, quietly, and hope it finds a place. They stood together for a long moment, letting the breeze carry their thoughts. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited the churchyard. She walked slowly between the stones, reading the names of men and women who had never been mysteries to anyone but time. At the far end, she knelt by Henrik's grave and laid a small bunch of violets across the earth. "You were not erased," she whispered. "You were just misunderstood." She returned to the guest house just in time for lunch. At the table were the remaining residents. Miss Hartley, still draped in her lace shawl despite the warming weather. Mr. Pomeroy, reading the paper with more concentration than usual. And Alice, who now sat not beside them, but opposite. The quiet host. No one spoke for a while. Then Miss Hartley cleared her throat. "I'm thinking of leaving next week. Visiting my niece in Cornwall, I think. A change of view might be good." Alice nodded. "We'll miss your stories." Miss Hartley gave a half smile. "I think I've told too many." Pomeroy folded his paper. "There's grace in silence too, Lillian." She rolled her eyes. "Don't get poetic on me, Vicar." They all laughed, softly, but it was the first real laugh in days. Miss Marple took a sip of tea and placed her cup down slowly. "There's something comforting about villages," she said, "even after they've been shaken. Perhaps because they've been shaken. The way people stitch themselves back together, not always neatly, but sincerely." They all nodded. "I was wrong," said Pomeroy after a pause. "About him. About myself." "So was I," said Miss Hartley. Alice looked at them both. "You were afraid." "We all were, even me. I wanted him to be something simple. A letter, a name. But people aren't simple." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, dear, but when we choose to see them completely, not as strangers or threats or disappointments, but as humans, we often find the mystery ends long before the crime is solved." The next morning, the 9:42 train from Lower Beckett Station pulled in beneath a silver sky. Miss Marple stood on the platform with her single leather case and her knitting bag. Alice had walked her there, wrapped in her shawl, hands tucked in her sleeves. "Will you come back?" Alice asked. "If the roses fail to bloom and the toast goes soft." Miss Marple said with a glint in her eye, "I'll be on the next train." Alice chuckled. "I think I'll be all right." Miss Marple looked at her closely. "You will be, because you've already chosen truth over fear. That is always the harder path, and the stronger one." The train's whistle blew. Miss Marple stepped aboard. Just before the doors closed, she turned and added softly, "Forgive Mrs. Claridge when you can. She didn't just try to protect you. She tried to erase pain with silence, and we both know that never works." Alice's eyes shimmered, but she nodded. As the train pulled away, the village slowly shrank into the distance. The rooftops, the spire, the curve of the path that led to the guest house, all of it disappeared into mist and memory. Inside her carriage, Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and withdrew the letter she had written the night before. It was addressed to her friend Dolly Bantry in St. Mary Mead. She reread it once, then tucked it into her handbag for posting. "Dearest Dolly, Lower Beckett has reminded me that not all crimes are born from greed or rage. Some come from love, twisted, frightened, well-intentioned love. And solving those, my dear, is harder than the ones with footprints and alibis. The man who died never left his name in the ledger, but he left something else behind, a daughter, a memory, and a village forced to ask whether the real danger lies in what we hide, or what we refuse to understand. I'll be home soon. Please warm the kettle. Fondly, Jane." Back in Lower Beckett, the autumn marigolds Alice had planted began to bloom beneath room 6's window. And for the first time in a long while, the village slept, not because it had forgotten, but because it had remembered fully. The man who arrived without a name had left behind a final truth. Even the quietest deaths deserve to be heard. Even the most forgotten people deserve to be known. And in the end, It was not a detective's brilliance, nor a confession, nor an arrest that restored peace. It was a garden replanted, a girl who stood her ground, and a woman with knitting needles who simply watched and listened.